Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. On today's episode, I spoke with Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is a history professor at the University of Connecticut, about her book Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology. She traces the origins of American reproductive health to slave hospitals. As white doctors expanded their practices onto plantations, quickly pregnancy and birth became their focus. While revolutionizing medical care, these doctors experimented and tortured enslaved women while creating groundless medical theories related to whiteness and blackness, men and women, and the inferiority of other races. Here's our conversation from March 12th, 2024.
My name is Deirdre Cooper Owens. I am a historian. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut, and I specialize in the history of the 19th century U.S., slavery, and the history of medicine.
Well, thank you for joining us. We are going to be talking about your book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology.
Yes.
And it was quite a read. There's some very disturbing aspects of this history, as we always come across in slavery histories. But could you begin by telling us how you got to researching this topic and what you came to find while researching?
It's interesting. I never set out to be a historian of medicine when I joined my PhD program. I knew I wanted to study the lives of enslaved people, specifically enslaved women, but I was just kind of trying to search, until my advisor threatened me with either you pick a subject or I will. And so in seminar one day, I was actually reading a book. And in it, there were two sentences, two or three, that talked about this guy I'd never heard of before, James Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology. And then the thing that really blew my mind, he had operated on enslaved women in Alabama. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm a graduate of 2 HBCUs. So for my undergrad, and also I got my master's from an HBCU, had never learned this. And this is 2005 when I was in this class. So this is before Henrietta Lacks was well known. We only knew about the Tuskegee syphilis study. And so I thought, this might really be a good dissertation. And that is really the moment that I kind of, the portal was opened and I went through and I learned so much about slavery, from the lens of medicine. But I also learned a lot about the intersection of the development of particular branches of medicine with immigration as well. So it really was, a learning experience for me in ways that I had not imagined when I first enrolled in UCLA's program.
Well, and that's one of the things I really appreciated about your book is how you tease out these threads and make those intersections, you weave them together really nicely. And I would love to start with how reproduction functioned in slavery, because that in itself is troubling and problematic, even before we get to white doctors.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And that's actually, I think a wonderful place to start. In fact, I'm giving a talk tomorrow to a group of teachers about how to teach American slavery. And I think there are certain foundational things we should know about what evolves into U.S. chattel slavery. So I like to go all the way back to the 1600s and really kind of at the start of the British colonial project and what becomes the United States. So one of the first laws, British laws, that's enacted on the colonies is this old law that comes from the Roman Greco world, and it's called Partus Sequitur Ventrum. And essentially it means that if a woman is enslaved, she passes on the condition of bondage or servitude to her child for life. And, I think it's really important to note this is one of the first laws that deals with both race and gender, right? There's no kind of, pulling it apart. So what it's also doing is turning a patriarchal society on its head when it comes to enslaved people. And so by the early 1700s, it's now quota. It's law in every slave-holding society, right? And so each colony is kind of its own separate, its own separate entity. But each of those slave-holding colonies, and it's pretty much, for the most part, all of them, or nearly all of them, they have these laws that slavery comes through the woman who is held in bondage and passed on to her child for life. And so people are like, I don't understand why. And I said, I need you to really think about this. And this is the part that gets a little tricky depending upon who you teach. So I can teach this to college students. They're all adults. This is the tricky part. Enslaved women are having children not only by enslaved men. And so reproductive labor is, it becomes very important and marks enslaved women and girls' lives, from literally birth until death. And so what that means is the domestic labor that's performed by women in the household. It is the reproductive labor of gestation, childbearing, breastfeeding, even the kind of, there's a process of turning nursing mothers into wet nurses for other children. And, many of those children are white children. And so all of this, engaging in physical, intimate relationships, forced oftentimes when it's not a person who they're married to on the slave plantation or farm. So all of these things encompass reproductive labor. It is a system that is literally built upon Black women and unfortunately girls' ability to become pregnant, have children, because everything has a price tag. That's what chattel slavery is about, right? The movable property and how much movable property costs. And so after the end of the transatlantic slave trade that the Constitution outlaws in 1807, it becomes vitally important for this new nation, the United States, to invest in, in the natural production, as it was called, of enslaved people.
Well, I thank you for that. And I think the thing that you really hammer home in the book is that this sexualization of slavery becomes a location by which race is encoded and defined again. And I would love for you to talk, because we have talked in other sessions with other people about African American and African midwives and how birthing was brought here by natives of Africa. Suddenly, white doctors, white men, become very, very fascinated and obsessed with this reproductive health of enslaved women. And when they enter the scene, a lot of terrible things start happening.
Yeah, so this is for millennia, as we know, and it doesn't matter what continent, what nation, childbirth, pregnancy, all of that done by women, right? And men were okay with that. We will let the midwives do that. And all of a sudden, you have in Europe and in the United States, around the late 18th century, but really the 19th century, you have a flowering, really an explosion of white men who are now interested in formally becoming trained in, what was initially known as midwifery, now obstetrics and gynecology, right? And they're doing things that midwives had not really done before. So there is the introduction of surgical tools that makes, the birthing experience now very different. Even positions of where women are giving birth and how they're giving birth is done for the comfort of the doctor, not necessarily the mother, who is giving birth. And so there's so much that changes. right? Where, many of those procedures are dangerous because people don't know about germ theory until the very late 19th century. But what's important, right? It's not that white men decide one day, oh, I want to go to med school and work on women, because there's still these gender ideals and constructions around gender that say it's immoral, it's not proper for men to look at women's bodies, that this is something that women should deal with. But what starts to happen is when you have the rise of the hospital in the 1830s, this is the antebellum era, you start to have this concentration, as I mentioned before, with enslaved women, you know, being encouraged to have more children, right? People are living longer, right? And so women are having multiple pregnancies. I mean, it's like a confluence of all of these factors. And with the rise of these formalized medical institutions, you start to have men entering into this field. And as men enter into the field, they're saying, wait, oh, these midwives, they're just ignorant. They don't know, right? They haven't gone to school. They haven't apprenticed in the ways that we've apprenticed. They've not performed autopsies. And all of a sudden, the formalized medical education then supersedes, the kind of millennia-old training that midwives brought. And in the United States, because it is a society that is essentially divided by who's free and who's enslaved, right, in terms of one's status, what happens is in slaveholding societies, you do have Black women who are held in bondage, who are performing many of the healing arts, right? So there might be, old slave midwives, sometimes derisively called granny midwives, right? A lot of midwives of the 21st century have reclaimed that title and call them grand midwives. You had white women who were also midwives, and they were going around local communities and catching babies, from white women, Black women, indigenous women. So there was this real integration of cultural practices that women were having, but primarily in slave communities, it's Black women who are performing these acts. And so there's already trust and a bond that's there. When a white male doctor is doing this work in the 19th century, that's when you know it's something serious, because most enslaved midwives, enslaved nurses are not going to call a doctor to come in unless it is dire in an emergency situation, which is the process of pregnancy becoming medicalized and seen as a medical condition and oftentimes treated like a disease.
Oh, yeah, and that's leads me to my next point, which is there are things that go wrong. And there were these conditions that I don't want to get into because they're they kind of get a little messy very quickly. But so there is this medical necessity, but at the same time, the revolution that these white doctors bring in is at the expense, the experimentation and torture of Black women who had no agency, which you're very clear in the book about. These are enslaved people who have no ability to say no.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's I think I jumped at the chance when I heard you say agency, because that is something that's a really sensitive topic. Most people become, in our contemporary society, they hear these women were performed and experimented on, and they had no agency. And as someone who is a historian of slavery, I have to say, what enslaved person had agency? That's just par for the course in a slave society. And so it's very shocking for us to think that someone could have these experimental surgeries performed on them. This is natural in terms of a 19th century slave society. And the US is a slave society, right? In terms of the people who hold power, what gives the United States its wealth, its slavery as an economic and labor institution. And so once I explain that to folk, I'm like, it's not a point that I could necessarily make the central argument in my book, because historians would say, okay, yeah, we know that. Now what? And so what I try to do, though, is pivot our attention as opposed to focusing on agency and to say, but let's think about what actually happens during this moment. So you are literally treating human beings legally as chattel or movable property. So what a lot of doctors do, and it's not just James Marion Sims, who I mentioned, right? He's just kind of one of many men of his generation doing this, but they go to owners and they'll say, hey, I know that you have some slaves suffering from a particular gynecological condition, and I think I can possibly fix them or cure them, to use the 19th century terms. Can I lease them from you? So the agency is between the owners, right? And most of these physicians that I write about are slave owning physicians. And so, for me, it's about, we understand that part of slavery, but let's also talk about what science means and also what it does to the patients who are enslaved. So the reigning scientific beliefs during this time are that women are a subset of men, but also Black people are essentially a subset of white people, that they are in an arrested state of intellectual development, right? They're like children. And so they're different biologically, they're distinctive genetically from white people. And this is where, I term this kind of racial cognitive dissonance, right? A fancy way of saying, so here are the lies and the fictions that come up. Because if you are experimenting on people who are so different than you, why are you using the same surgical methods and practices and treatments to cure white women? Because it would seem to me, I'm not going to experiment on someone who's genetically, biologically different. So that must mean they have a different cervix or different ovaries. They are literally, they know that these things are racial fictions, right? It's that kind of racial cognitive dissonance. And so the doctors will hold on to the scientific beliefs, but I often say when you read their medical notes, their case books, you look at their medical journal articles, what you'll find is they're writing about these Black patients in the very same way that they're writing about white patients in terms of what they're doing, right? That doesn't mean that some of the treatment isn't different. Like, for instance, the white women patients are clothed, the Black women are naked. So there are all those kinds of things that are kind of guided by anti-Blackness. But overall, if they're making an incision in this direction, it's the same incision that they're going to make on this white woman patient. So those are the things that are happening. The other thing that I think is really important too is to think about what this does when you talk about, what is, for me, the kind of brutality and sadness around this. Many of these women are suffering from conditions no woman wants. Not today and not in the 19th century, where you're suffering incontinence or, you have a smell or you're getting infections. I mean, just, a number of things. It might affect your fertility. So these are conditions that clearly no woman wants to have to contend with. But you're taking people from communities and families and friends that they've known for a lifetime, that they love, and you're taking them and you're putting them into the strange space with other enslaved people that they don't know, and you're saying, you can't go until I fix you. And for many of these doctors, these repeated surgeries take years, right? And so that's also a part of, a kind of part of the history that I think people don't necessarily focus on, right? The kinds of break from the community that these women have to endure. And I often say, they're human beings, so they might not have liked each other. Somebody might not have liked the next person, in the, sitting next to them. They're being forced to do work. What if someone's squeamish and all of a sudden she has to assist the doctor with cutting on her, another patient, a fellow enslaved woman. So there are all of these psychological dimensions as well when we're talking about, the growth and the development, and that also the doctors often train the enslaved women to assist them doing this kind of medical work. And that's a whole nother conversation, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and that the patient as nurse, as someone who's, you're being operated on 1 month and then you're helping with an operation on another month, incredibly terrible to me. I mean, it was like, that's a nightmare I can't even imagine living.
Yeah.
But I want to return to the medical journals, because I like what you said, where this cognitive dissonance, and it's one of the things that I've tried to tease out in all these conversations, is these inherent contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
While they're, systematizing human anatomy and
Mm-hmm.
figuring out what's going on with the human, they're also searching for this elusive, imaginary racial difference. And there's this ideological bent to everything they write, which you really do a good job in tying not only to misogyny, but also racism.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to tell us how the
Yeah.
medical journals and these doctors, in their quest for healing, also really contributed to the
Yeah.
medicalization of racism.
Oh, yeah. It's, one of the most popular topics, even today, is this notion that Black people don't experience pain. Or if they do, it's a very different kind of pain than white patients. I mean, this is an old idea from the 18th century that extends to the 21st century. So it's kind of like a chain that's not been broken in some ways. And so I often have my students read primary sources, and I'll say, okay, let's look at Benjamin Rush's 1799 published article, right, where he talks about leprosy as a disease that causes Blackness. So the reason that people are Black in terms of their race and their hue is because of leprosy. And so there's a passage that is in this primary source document. And I will say this, he actually gave the talk in I think it was 1794, if I'm not mistaken, at the American Philosophical Society. So here's a man considered the father of American medicine and the father of American psychiatry. He's the only medical doctor who signs the Declaration of Independence. So he's a founding father. And he's also, today we would say, he's progressive. He was liberal, women's rights and abolition and all of these things. So he writes, I have witnessed the cutting of the limb of a Negro who was so insensible to the pain, he held up his leg as if, as if he had just found it, that there was no pain. And so this idea, that people sometimes want to peg on, James Marion Sims, oh, he created this. I was like, no. This is a long-standing idea. And in fact, Benjamin Rush is quoting European doctors who had written about this earlier in the 18th century. And so those are some of the things. I often say, this is where we know it's a racial fiction, because during James Marion Sims's experimentation phase in Alabama, guess what? One of those enslaved women, they give birth to a mulatto child. So if they're really biologically different, why are you impregnating this Black woman? I use Thomas Jefferson's only published work. I talk about his famous passage, Query 14, right? Thomas Jefferson was a man of science, not necessarily medicine, but a man of higher thinking. And he writes in Query 14 that the reason that Africans, especially Black women, look the way they do is because the women choose to engage in physical intimacy. I'm using, kind of coded language here because this is a sensitive topic, with orangutans rather than their own men. But this is the same man who had children by a woman that he owned, right? Multiple children. And, Annette Gordon Reed, his most famous biographer, who won a Pulitzer, noted for every pregnancy that Sally Hemings had, Thomas Jefferson was there and he named each child, right? It was written in his records. And so once again, here are men saying, Black people are like apes, or Black people don't experience pain. All of these things that, are a part and parcel of the anti-Blackness that permeates the time period. And yet they're doing things that are often oppositional to what they're writing, right? And so for me, it goes to show that the science was not objective, right? Because human beings are the ones who are enacting the, kind of conducting the experiments. Human beings are the ones who are writing the books with their own biases. But also, I often want, I tell my students, because they're like, well, why are they allowed to do it? I said, you have to think, particularly in the slaveholding South, by the 19th century, integration is illegal. You cannot write that Black people and white people are the same. I said, it's a crime. So where are they going to publish this? I mean, they can't. And so it just is baked into the system to the point where the legacy is now in the 21st century, you have medical professionals who are still contending with really old, outdated, harmful beliefs about biological differences between human beings.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you drive the point home, I think, brilliantly by introducing the Irish to
Yes.
the whole story, because I think your point in doing it is to show how this could have been a different story.
Yes.
Had it not been an enslaved society and one that was deeply entrenched in white supremacy. So just briefly, kind of tell us how the Irish experience was against the African American experience.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I just did some work for Mount Sinai Hospital that is in possession of the James Marion Sims casebooks when he moved from the South to New York and founded the women's hospital there. And overwhelmingly in the casebooks, like, this is kind of a guesstimate because we didn't run the calculations. I would say over 85%, maybe higher, of those patients listed Irish, 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 Irish. And so it's where where the hospital was located, Also, a part of what I wondered, and this was just in October when I was there doing this work. I wondered, I said, how did all these Irish women know to come to this hospital? How did all of these women know if they had this particular condition to go to this hospital for surgery? So that's one. They were vulnerable, they were sick. Most of them that I wrote about in my book had come from Western Ireland, which today contains some of the poorest sections of, the island nation. And so you're dealing with a dispossessed group, a group that has been, that was racialized in the 19th century. The difference is, though, these are people who eventually, they are assimilated into whiteness. I often say, even in today's society, most African Americans who are descendants of enslaved people in the United States, even the Caribbean, but because I focus on the United States, we have white ancestry. We have European blood. We're never accorded whiteness. So you could be Barack Obama. You're not Barack Obama, the first Black and white president, or white president. He's the first Black president, because that takes precedence, right? Not the fact that he grew up with white grandparents or had a white mom. And so there's the difference that continues. Once again, that's one of the retentions of this, that, by the second to third generation, Irish people are then kind of collapsed into whiteness, and so there's the difference. Also, even though these women are living lives none of us would elect to live, in the 21st century, but there's a point where even when you're healed, you're free. And so you can go back to your community, you can go back to your family. When you're enslaved and your body is healed through these surgeries, you go back to slavery. I mean, you go back to labor. And so that's, there is no, you could be mulatto, you could be octoroon, all of these racial categorizations of, kind of diminishing Blackness, but you were still enslaved. And so there's a difference, right? And so what I argue in the book, that there's a kind of mapping that Sims does in particular, because he founds this hospital in New York. There's a mapping of Blackness that he does on this dispossessed, poor immigrant group that's also dealing with the xenophobia of the time, the anti-Irish sentiments in many urban areas and metropolises. the fact that they are a population that doesn't have the same kind of agency as groups that had been here earlier and more established because of the kinds of ghettoized communities that they're living in, their Catholicism that sets them apart, from Protestant Christians. And so there is this sense too that the Irish are a bit more vulnerable, right? Until they aren't. Yeah.
Right. And I think that point you make about the returning to slavery is incredibly important, because one of the things you mentioned in the book is the Irish embrace of institutions allows them to open a window into white society. But the fact that they were allowed into the institutions to begin with allows that window to even be open for the countless number of enslaved women who went through some of this Sims's machine, I guess. Maybe you could kind of wind up with what Sims's legacy is for gynecology, and then also how how Black womanhood kind of was understood at that time, and going on even to, as you said, we're fighting it today.
Yeah, I think so. Sims has, as we know, a fraught legacy. There is no mistaking that his surgical reparative technique essentially, obliterates what today we would call obstetrical fistula in this country, right? You say, oh, obstetrical fistula, most people are going to say, well, what's that? They haven't heard of it. And so his technique is still being used to this day. The tools that he improved still being used to this day. At the very end of my book, I talk about my own IVF trials. Sims was, one of the first doctors in this nation to say, I don't think it's just women who suffer from infertility, but men can suffer as well. So he's pioneered a lot in terms of reproductive medicine. This is where I use the both and, because oftentimes I think people use either or. He's either a savior or he's a demon. And I'm like, so things are a bit more complicated, right? And this is not, for me, this is not the defense of Sims, but the reason I say both and, so yes, he made these contributions, but once again, what does it do to a community that's suffering this kind of fracture? What does it do when, until my book was published, Black women, these enslaved women, were erased from the historical record? And it wasn't that Sims or his colleagues erased them. Historians after them just acted like what Sims and his colleagues wrote didn't exist. And I'm sitting here like, wait, they said the slave, Negro, the Negress. I mean, they were very clear about who these people were. And by the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was like enslaved people didn't exist in this kind of experimentation. So until my book came out in 2017, people were saying, oh, Sims founded the first hospital for women in the US, and it was in New York. And I'm like, but he literally told us the first hospital that he built for women's conditions was in Alabama, and it was a slave hospital, right? And so for me, it's about not having a fragmented history, but how do we make history as holistic and as accurate as possible, relying on the sources of the time, knowing that those sources are often biased and problematic, and we are dealing with a population that was largely illiterate, so they didn't leave written sources, that there are always going to be these holes or these gaps that are left. But how do we talk about the history of medicine without including the patients? And how do we talk about the history of medicine when we understand that slavery was established in what becomes the United States longer than democracy has been present? And so that is something. So literally from, the moment of European exploration, slavery was established. Slavery ends in 1865. And so it's, slavery as an institution was older than American democracy. So I'm saying we can't tell these stories without telling all of it. And so I think for me, the legacy of Sims is to question the structural components of medical science that talk about this distinctiveness between the races, and why that belief is so persistent. It has us to really center biomedical ethics, which I also think is important. And so many hospitals and institutions now have biomedical ethicists, particularly if they have medical students or medical college. And I think the other legacy for Black women, that I've seen just a flowering of this, you have a lot of Black women who are looking at the blueprint that their foremothers left for them. And so it's an amazing pipeline I'm seeing now of Black women who are saying, you know what, we'll continue to build our own institutions. So they become doulas. I mean, my Lord, in places like New York and LA and San Francisco and Baltimore and Detroit, I mean, especially in urban areas, the number of Black doulas is just amazing. But what I'm also seeing, it's a little bit more expensive and competitive to become a midwife, but I'm also seeing an uptick in Black women who are becoming midwives, who are electing to have births in birthing centers or at their homes. And so that also, I think, is a really important legacy of care that they're borrowing from.
Well, thank you for your work, because it's incredibly important. I think one of the things that you touched on right at the end, which I think needs to be driven home, is a lot of the scholarship, I think, and it's being corrected now, like by people like you, is to say that slavery was not what the South would have us believe. It was not paternalistic. It was incredibly brutal. It was incredibly harsh and violent and exploitative in a way that knowing another person is only a part of it. You know, I think that's restoring these stories of the people who contributed to, whether against their will, most of the time, is incredibly important. And your book is fantastic at doing that. So thank you for that.
Oh, you are welcome. Thank you. There is something I want to say. As a daughter of the South, my family has ties to South Carolina, when it was a British colony. So, you know, my ancestors came to South Carolina hundreds of years ago. And, you know, it's, for me, what is, I think, the most accurate depiction, even though the film took some, let's say, it took some creative and artistic licenses, but Django Unchained. And there's this scene where Leonardo DiCaprio plays like kind of the villainous slave owner, and there's Jamie Foxx, and then there's the actor, I can't think of his name, but he plays a German dentist. And anyway, there's this really brutal scene where Leonardo DiCaprio is applying corporal punishment in just a really violent way, right? It's a Quentin Tarantino film, so one can expect that. But there's this woman playing beautiful classical music on a harp. And there's this scene of this beautifully, curated table and a wonderfully decorated white sheet cake. And after Leonardo DiCaprio, finishes, he commences with the beating. Jamie Foxx's character is just kind of stunned. The German dentist is brought to tears because he's never seen it. And he says, in Leonardo DiCaprio's character as a slave owner, says, "Oh, would y'all like some white cake?" as the music is still playing. And that's, when I teach a slavery and film course to my college students, I often stop it. And I said, that's a dehumanization that we're talking about. That we often think it's about the enslaved person. But what does a system do to someone who can beat you brutally? And then as soon as they stop, but you're like, they're now polite and courteous and offering a slice of white sheet cake, right? As the music plays in the background. And so what I wanted to do was to show the humanity of the people who were supposed to be dehumanized, but also, like you say, in as a stark way as I could from the primary sources that were available, reveal slavery from the perspective of the men who were running the institution as well.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.